In the burning cradle of the American Southwest, where jagged cliffs meet the endless desert sky, a legend was born. Not with fanfare, not in the pages of a book, but in the rhythms of war drums, whispers of wind, and the sacred silence of mountains. Around the year 1805, in the rugged terrain that now straddles southern Arizona and northern Mexico, a boy came into the world who would become one of the most revered and feared figures of the Old West. His name would echo across time: Cochise. He was born into the Chiricahua Apache, a fierce and proud band of the Apache Nation, known for their independence, unmatched resilience, and deep spiritual ties to the land. The Chiricahua were not simply survivors of the desert, they were masters of it, moving like shadows, living in harmony with the harsh land that had raised them. To be born Chiricahua was to be born into an unyielding world of honor, resistance, and tradition, and from his earliest steps, Cochise walked in the footsteps of warriors. From the time he could walk, Cochise was prepared for a life that demanded strength, of body, of spirit, of will. His world was one of ceremony and training, of elders telling stories beneath starlit skies, and young boys learning to track, ride, fight, and endure. He was raised not in fear of death, but with the knowledge that defending his people might demand it. Among the Chiricahua, courage was not a boast, it was a responsibility. The Apache saw the world as a living force. Mountains, rivers, and winds were not just elements, but relatives, guides, protectors. Cochise learned this connection early, absorbing not only the warrior's code, but the spiritual lifeblood of his people. Their way was oral, sacred, passed through generations in teachings, chants, and visions. And Cochise listened. He was quiet, thoughtful, a student of nature and human nature alike. But in him burned a flame, a readiness, a fury waiting for purpose. No one then could have known that this boy would rise to become a giant of resistance, that he would lead his people through one of the most grueling and heroic chapters of the Apache struggle. That his name would one day stand alongside Geronimo, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, as a symbol not just of defiance, but of dignity. Before the bullets and the betrayals, before treaties and trails of blood, there was simply Cochise, a child of the desert, molded by the mountains, destined to carry the soul of a nation on his shoulders. His was not a story born in Washington or written by generals. His story began with the earth, the fire, the wind, and a promise made in silence to never kneel and never forget who he was. He was forged in fire long before the flames of war engulfed his people. A child of the mountains and the wind, Cochise grew up running barefoot across the arid deserts of what would become southern Arizona and northern Mexico, his senses sharpened by the rhythms of the land and the whispers of his ancestors. His birth, around 1805, marked not the beginning of a life but the continuation of a resistance that had echoed across generations. He was Chiricahua Apache of the Choconen band, and that alone meant he carried the weight of defiance in his blood. During the early decades of the 19th century, the lands of the Apache were vast and sacred, stretching from the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains to the lush canyons of the Sierra Madre. These were not merely places of survival, but of ceremony, legacy, and identity. And for a brief time, there was peace, tenuous but real. The Spanish and later the newly independent Mexican government made attempts to coexist with the Apache. Trade routes were established, treaties were signed. There was bloodshed, yes, but also breathing room. And young Cochise, still learning the spiritual codes and warrior rites of his people, observed this world in flux. But history does not wait patiently. As the United States began its relentless march westward, manifest destiny arrived like a storm on horseback. The gold seekers, settlers, and military outposts came one by one, then all at once. And with them came broken promises, barbed wire, and new flags planted in soil that was not theirs. For the Apache, the Americans were not just strangers. They were a new breed of invader. They did not seek balance. They sought dominion. Cochise, now a man, a warrior in his prime, watched as lines were drawn across the lands of his ancestors by men who had never set foot in them. But he was not content to merely watch. Already known among the Apache for his sharp intellect and unshakable calm, Cochise began to take on more responsibility within his band. He rode at the head of raids and led defensive strikes against those who encroached too far. He became a ghost in the eyes of his enemies, silent, strategic, and always one step ahead. But it was not warfare for warfare's sake. Cochise, like many Apache leaders, sought autonomy, not annihilation. His warriors struck only when provoked, when treaties were betrayed, or when their families were threatened. He was not driven by hate. He was driven by memory, of a time when his people roamed free, unshackled by borders or reservations. The American expansion, however, knew no compromise. Tensions flared as U.S. forts were built deeper into Apache territory. Hunters slaughtered buffalo herds, settlers fenced off water sources, and surveyors carved through sacred lands. And then in 1861, the fragile line between tension and war was finally shattered. It began with a kidnapping. A rancher's child was taken, possibly by a rogue band, possibly not by Apaches at all. But blame was cast on Cochise. Lieutenant George Bascom, a young and overzealous officer, demanded Cochise's presence at Apache Pass under the guise of diplomacy. When the chief arrived with his family, Bascom tried to detain him. Cochise escaped, barely, but his brother and several others were held hostage. The Apache Code of Honor could not allow that to stand. Cochise retaliated with his own hostages and attempted negotiations, but Bascom, driven by arrogance and poor judgment, refused. When negotiations broke down, violence followed. Both sides executed prisoners. The incident, forever known as the Bascom Affair, ignited a war that would burn for over a decade. From the shadows of the Dragoon Mountains, Cochise orchestrated a campaign of resistance unlike any the U.S. military had ever encountered. He mastered the terrain, used the desert as a weapon, and struck with the precision of a hawk. His warriors moved swiftly, appearing from nowhere, vanishing into the canyons. The Americans were slow, unprepared, and foreign to this landscape. They bled, often in ambushes, sometimes in direct confrontation, but always in confusion. Cochise did not fight alone. Other leaders like Mangas Coloradas, his father-in-law and the great chief of the Mimbreños, joined the cause. Together, they united various Apache bands into a force that threatened every military column sent against them. Apache Pass dos Cabezas Aravaipa. Each name became a warning whispered in the tents of soldiers. You are in Cochise's land now. And yet, war took its toll. Villages were destroyed, families torn apart, supplies dwindled, and with every U.S. campaign came more troops, more forts, and more suffering. Still, Cochise refused to surrender, but he was not without vision. He knew war could not last forever. He had seen what had become of other tribes, shattered, herded onto barren reservations. He did not want that fate, but neither would he kneel without honor. In 1872, after years of bloodshed and betrayal, a new figure entered the story. General Oliver O. Howard, a man the Apache began to call the Christian General. Howard, unlike his predecessors, sought peace not through force, but understanding. He met Cochise with respect. They spoke not as conqueror and conquered, but as men who had each seen too much blood. The result? An unprecedented treaty. Cochise would be granted a reservation in his ancestral homeland, the Chiricahua Apache Reservation, where his people could live freely, governed by their own laws. For a moment, peace seemed possible. And Cochise honored that peace. He laid down his rifle and took up the role of protector and patriarch. His warriors returned to their families. The desert knew silence again, but that peace would not last forever, and neither would Cochise. Beneath the blazing Arizona sun in early 1861, the desert trembled, not from thunder or earthquake, but from the weight of a betrayal that would ignite a war and change the fate of a nation. This was not a grand battle planned by generals or sanctioned by government. No, it began in a dusty corner of the frontier, with a misunderstanding drenched in arrogance, fear, and misjudgment. It began with one name, Lieutenant George Bascom, and it would forever stain the memory of the United States in Apache eyes. At the heart of it all stood Cochise, leader of the Choconen band of the Chiricahua Apache. By this time, Cochise was already known as a man of fierce honor, a warrior and strategist who valued diplomacy when possible, but who would never, ever allow his people to be humiliated or dishonored. He had lived through years of delicate balance between his people and both the Mexican and American governments. But all that would be undone by a single, catastrophic decision. In January of 1861, a young Anglo-American boy named Felix Ward, the stepson of a rancher, was kidnapped during a raid in southern Arizona. The attackers were believed to be Pinal or Coyotero Apaches, both distinct from Cochise's Chiricahua band. But in the fog of frontier panic, the distinction didn't matter. The locals wanted someone to blame, and they found their scapegoat. Enter Lieutenant George Bascom, a young officer freshly stationed at Apache Pass, ambitious, inexperienced, and burning with the self-righteous fire of military authority. Armed with scant information and even less cultural understanding, Bascom received orders to investigate the kidnapping. Eager to make a name for himself, he summoned Cochise to parley at Butterfield's Overland Stage Station under the guise of peaceful negotiations. Cochise, confident in his innocence and committed to preserving relations with the Americans, arrived with several members of his family, including his wife, children, and brother. He came not as a war chief, but as a diplomat, a man of his word, willing to discuss the situation and seek justice through dialogue. He even offered to help find the actual culprits. But Bascom had already decided. Cochise would be taken hostage until the boy was returned. That decision would echo like a gunshot across generations. When Bascom attempted to arrest him, Cochise realized the trap. With lightning reflexes, he slashed through the tent, escaping into the hills, while his family was left behind, now captives of the U.S. Army. For Cochise, this was not merely a betrayal. It was an unforgivable desecration of Apache honor. The Apache viewed the act of diplomacy as sacred. To be tricked under the pretense of peace was worse than death. The blood price would be high. And Cochise did not wait. Within days he struck back. With the fury of a betrayed warrior and the precision of a seasoned strategist, Cochise launched a series of retaliatory attacks on stagecoaches, wagon trains, and isolated settlements. He captured several hostages, hoping to exchange them for his family. But Bascom, unyielding and blind to the cultural chasm between them, refused. The violence escalated. The situation spiraled into brutality on both sides. When negotiations failed once again, the U.S. Army hanged Cochise's brother and nephews, believing this act would end the resistance. Instead, it poured fuel onto a wildfire. Cochise, heartbroken and enraged, transformed overnight from cautious ally to relentless enemy. What followed was over a decade of guerrilla warfare, the likes of which the U.S. military had never encountered. The terrain became his weapon, the canyons, his fortress, his warriors, invisible by day, deadly by night. The Bascom Affair, as it would later be called, was the spark that ignited the Apache Wars, a brutal conflict that would stretch across decades, involving some of the most legendary names of the American West. But to Cochise, it was never about glory or conquest. It was about betrayal, about the lives of his people, about a moment when trust was shattered and peace was traded for deception at the barrel of a gun. It's important to understand, Cochise did not seek war. He had been a man of reason, a negotiator. The Apache way was not to dominate, but to survive, to live in balance with the land. The war that followed wasn't his ambition. It was the result of arrogance and ignorance, of a young lieutenant who didn't see a proud chief in front of him, but a savage to be subdued. What might have been avoided with empathy and respect became a war soaked in blood, a war where neither side would walk away unscarred. And in the minds of the Chiricahua, the betrayal of 1861 was never forgotten. It lived on in the cries of mothers who buried their children in the war songs, sung beside campfires in the eyes of a chief who had tried to meet peace with peace, but was forced to answer violence with fire. The Incidente de Bascom was not just a tactical blunder. It was a moral collapse, a crack in the fragile trust between the Apache and the United States that would never fully heal. And for Cochise, it marked a turning point, not just in the story of a man, but in the destiny of a people. From this moment forward, he would be a warrior not of raids but of vengeance, not for conquest but for justice. And the deserts of the Southwest would tremble beneath the hoofbeats of Apache resistance, led by a chief who had been betrayed in parley, but who would never be conquered in war. They called him Ghost in the Rocks, a phantom of the desert wind. To his people, he was a shield, fierce, wise, unbreakable. To his enemies, he was an elusive shadow who vanished into the canyons, only to strike again with fire and fury. His name was Cochise, chief of the Choconen band of the Chiricahua Apache. And for more than a decade, he led one of the most brilliant campaigns of resistance in the entire history of the American West. By the time war exploded between his people and the United States in 1861, Cochise had already become a seasoned warrior, but the conflict that now gripped the Southwest would elevate him to legend. This wasn't a war for territory, it was a war for survival, for dignity, for the soul of a people whose world was being trampled under boots and treaties that meant nothing. From the moment of the Bascom incident, when Cochise was falsely accused of kidnapping and then betrayed under a flag of peace, the land was never quiet again. Rage erupted like thunder across the Sonoran Desert, and the Apache, under Cochise's command, launched a war of guerrilla resistance unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever faced. He didn't march in straight lines. He didn't wear uniforms. He didn't fight for conquest. He fought because the mountains, the rivers, the trees, they were his birthright, and he knew them like the lines in his hand. For more than 10 years, from 1861 to 1872, Cochise turned the terrain itself into his most deadly weapon. The Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona became a fortress, and from these granite spires, Cochise struck with deadly precision. His warriors moved like wind, striking supply routes, military columns, and outposts, and then, as if swallowed by the land, they vanished. U.S. soldiers who entered Apache territory often never returned. Others lived in constant dread. Even experienced officers trained in warfare from the plains to the East Coast found themselves outwitted by Cochise's tactical genius. He used deception, ambush, and misdirection like a master chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always using the harsh terrain as a blade against his enemies. But Cochise was more than a warrior. He was a strategist, a leader, and most importantly, a father to his people. His warfare was not indiscriminate. He followed a code. Civilians, when possible, were spared. Women and children were protected. He understood honor, even in a war that offered little of it in return. While the U.S. painted him as a savage, those who met him in person often told a different story. Tall, dignified, calm under pressure, with piercing eyes that seemed to measure the soul, Cochise commanded respect even from his adversaries. He was not a man of chaos. He was a man driven to war by betrayal, and every drop of blood spilled in that conflict was a result of broken promises, not bloodlust. During these long years of war, Cochise did not stand alone. He forged powerful alliances with other great Apache leaders, including his father-in-law, Mangus Coloradas, another titan of resistance. Together, they united various bands of the Apache under a common cause. They shared resources, intelligence, and tactics, and together they made it clear: the Apache were not leaving. They were not surrendering. Not without a fight that would be written in blood and remembered in the bones of the land. But war takes its toll, even on the strongest. For every ambush that succeeded, there were retaliations. Villages burned, women captured, hunger and disease crept into the camps. Children were born in hiding. Mothers nursed infants in caves while soldiers hunted nearby. The Apache endured, but the cost was high. By the late 1860s, the war had reached a grim stalemate. The U.S. Army had poured troops into the region. New forts rose across Arizona and New Mexico. The Apache, though fierce and fearless, were vastly outnumbered. Supplies ran low. Winter came harder every year. The enemy adapted. The noose was tightening. And yet Cochise held on. Because this wasn't just about land. It was about memory, identity. Everything the Apache were, their songs, their stories, their way of life, was under threat. And Cochise knew that if they surrendered now, they would lose more than battles. They would lose who they were. Still, even the strongest mountain eventually feels erosion. And by the early 1870s, Cochise, older and tired of endless bloodshed, began to consider what few leaders of his caliber could: peace. Not surrender, not defeat, but a negotiated, honorable end. It was a bold decision, dangerous even. But for Cochise, leadership wasn't just about fighting, it was about survival. And when General Oliver O. Howard, known as the Christian General, entered the picture in 1872, a rare opportunity opened. Howard, unlike many military men before him, came not with cannons, but with ears. He listened. He respected Cochise. He saw not a savage, but a sovereign leader trying to protect his people. And most importantly, he brought with him a man who could bridge two worlds, Tom Jeffords. Jeffords was an Indian agent who had gained Cochise's trust, a feat almost no white man could claim. Through Jeffords, the talks moved forward. No lies, no double crosses, no Bascom betrayal. And finally, after more than a decade of smoke and death, the two sides struck a peace. A reservation would be created in the very lands Cochise called home, not in some distant desert far from the mountains. And Cochise, now in his late 60s, would live to see his people at peace, wounded but unbroken, scarred but still sovereign. For the first time in years, the war drums fell silent. But legends are not meant to rest for long. Though peace had come, Cochise's time was drawing to an end. His body, worn by years of battle, began to fail him. Yet even in illness, he remained the spirit of the land, resolute, proud, and immortal in the eyes of his people. He died in 1874, just 2 years after the peace he had brokered. His body was buried in a secret location somewhere in the Dragoon Mountains, hidden, sacred, never found. Because men like Cochise are not meant to lie under marked stones, they are meant to live in the wind, to ride forever across the ridgelines of memory and myth, to remind us that resistance, when righteous, is never in vain. In the unforgiving heart of the American Southwest, where red dust blew through scorched canyons and silence could be shattered by a single war cry, a storm was gathering. The year was 1863, and the land was already soaked in tension, betrayal, and blood. But what happened next would set fire to everything. It began with a name spoken in reverence and fear, Mangas Coloradas. A warrior of immense stature and resolve, he was more than just a chief. He was the embodiment of Apache resistance. To his people, he was a father, a general, a wise man of the mountain. To the U.S. Army, he was a problem to be solved. That solution came in the dead of winter, not on the battlefield, but under the false flag of peace. At the age of nearly 70, Mangas Coloradas had agreed to parley with American military leaders under a promise of safety. His intent was to seek peace, a weary warrior looking to spare his people from further suffering. But what met him at Fort McLean in New Mexico was not diplomacy. It was betrayal. Upon arrival, he was taken into custody, shackled and tortured. Soldiers heated bayonets in fire and pressed them against his skin. That night, without a trial, without honor, Mangas Coloradas was executed, shot in the head and chest by guards who claimed he was trying to escape. His lifeless body was mutilated, his head severed and sent east for study, a grotesque trophy of conquest. When word reached Cochise, something inside him changed forever. The man who had once entertained diplomacy, the leader who had once tried to believe in peace, was gone. What rose in his place was a firestorm of fury, vengeance, and unrelenting resistance. Cochise had lost not just an ally, but a symbol of wisdom, leadership, and Apache pride. He would not forgive, and he would never forget. Overnight, Cochise transformed from a tactical guerrilla fighter into an embodiment of wrath. He no longer saw the U.S. soldiers as misguided men under orders. He saw them as executioners cloaked in uniform, representatives of a nation that knew nothing of honor, only treachery. And so began one of the most brutal, sustained, and strategically brilliant native resistance campaigns in the history of the American frontier. From the canyons of the Dragoon Mountains to the vast desert plains of what is now Arizona and New Mexico, Cochise and his warriors struck with surgical precision. They knew the land better than any map, could vanish into ravines like ghosts, and reappear days later to strike again. Telegraph lines were cut. Supply wagons vanished. Outposts were attacked in the dead of night. American soldiers called them phantoms of the cliffs. But they weren't phantoms. They were avengers. They were a people who had lost too much to remain still. Cochise led his men not only with weapons but with fury sharpened by memory, the memory of a friend who had been burned and butchered, of a peace violated, of trust shattered. Settlers lived in constant fear. Military columns moved through the territory, but rarely caught sight of the enemy, only the aftermath. Burned wagons, empty shoes, desert winds whispering the names of the fallen. Yet Cochise was not a savage, as some would later try to depict him. He remained, even in the fire of vengeance, a man of principles. He ordered his warriors to avoid killing women and children when possible. He knew the difference between revenge and atrocity, but he no longer held hope for reconciliation. The Dragoon Mountains became his fortress, a natural stronghold of granite and shadow. From there he commanded lightning raids that punished soldiers and settlers alike, sending a message with every fallen patrol: "You broke the code. Now face the storm." Meanwhile, U.S. military leaders debated how to contain him. More troops were sent, more forts were built. But the harder they tried to cage him, the more elusive he became. Cochise was not just a warrior, he was the land itself, vast, unyielding, and unforgiving. Between 1863 and the early 1870s, his campaign left an indelible scar on the efforts of the U.S. government to claim the Southwest. Hundreds of lives were lost. Entire settlements were abandoned. And through it all, Cochise's legend grew, whispered in bunkhouses and saloons across the West. Some called him a devil, others called him a hero. The truth was far more complicated. He was both and neither. He was Apache, and that meant something far deeper than most Americans of the time could comprehend. It meant belonging to the land, to one's people, to a lineage of warriors who fought not for conquest but for survival, dignity, and the right to exist. Every raid Cochise led after 1863 was marked by the shadow of Mangus Coloradas. The ghost of his fallen mentor haunted each battle cry, and Cochise carried that memory not as a burden, but as fuel for the fire. But even warriors burn out, and as the years dragged on, Cochise began to realize that revenge, while righteous, was endless. His people were weary. His warriors had children now, and so in time the fire would give way to something else. But not yet. In 1863, the war between the Chiricahua Apaches and the United States became something deeper than just a military conflict. It became a sacred oath of remembrance, and it was signed not with ink but with blood. After more than a decade of bloodshed, of fire and fury echoing through the canyons of the Southwest, the ground beneath Cochise's feet began to shift, not with the charge of cavalry but with something far more rare, the quiet rustle of diplomacy. It was 1872. The war between the Chiricahua Apaches and the United States had worn deep scars into both sides. Hundreds had died. Families had been shattered. Soldiers and scouts had come and gone, but no force had truly broken Cochise's will. And yet, time itself, the greatest enemy of warriors, was beginning to whisper in his ear. His people were tired. The land had grown weary of war. Cochise had spent a lifetime on horseback, leading raids, evading ambushes, burying the dead, and watching as promises turned to ashes. But now something unexpected was on the horizon, an offer, not of surrender but of survival. Enter General Oliver O. Howard, a one-armed Civil War veteran known not only for his discipline, but for his compassion. He had fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Union campaign, yet believed deeply in reconciliation and fairness. When the U.S. government tasked him with resolving the Apache problem, Howard made a decision few others would have dared. He would find Cochise, not to trap him, not to kill him, but to speak with him. The military called it madness. The West called it suicide. But Howard believed that peace was possible if he could find a way into Cochise's world, not with rifles, but with respect. But there was a problem. Cochise had spent years disappearing into the Dragoon Mountains like a wraith. He was untrackable, uncatchable, unbroken. No white man could simply request an audience. They needed someone who had done the impossible. They needed Tom Jeffords. Jeffords was no ordinary white man. A former scout and Indian agent, He had lived among the Apache, spoken their language, and, perhaps most incredibly, earned Cochise's trust. Where most saw Apaches as savages, Jeffords saw a people defending their way of life. Where others came with treaties, Jeffords came with truth, and for that he was one of the very few white men who could ride into the dragoon stronghold and emerge alive. So, together, Jeffords and General Howard ventured into the Apache wilderness, deep into the shadows of the mountains that had swallowed so many before them. They came unarmed, no columns of troops, no wagons of firepower, just two men seeking to end a war. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Cochise agreed to meet. Imagine the scene, a campfire flickering against stone, silent warriors watching from the dark, the fate of a nation resting on the words of men who, until now, had only communicated through bullets and blood. Cochise did not greet Howard as a friend. He was wary, sharp-eyed, still cloaked in the memory of betrayals past. But he listened. Howard did not lecture, he did not command. He spoke with honesty, he acknowledged the injustices, and he offered something that Cochise had not heard from a U.S. officer in years, a promise of autonomy. But it was Jeffords, the bridge between two worlds, who made it possible. When Cochise asked, "Will the Americans break this promise like all the others?" it was Jeffords who looked him in the eye and said, "Not while I live." That moment, more than any treaty or document, built the foundation of peace. Cochise agreed, but on one condition. His people would not be relocated far from their ancestral land. They would not be torn from the red earth that birthed them. They would not be herded onto distant plains or foreign deserts. If peace was to be real, it had to be rooted in the soil of their ancestors. Howard accepted. The Chiricahua Apache Reservation was established in the southeastern corner of Arizona, near the familiar shadows of the Dragoon Mountains. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't prosperity. But it was home, and for the first time in over a decade, it was peace. Cochise returned to his people not as a warrior in blood-soaked glory, but as a leader who had secured survival without surrender. He did what few men in his position could have done. He put down the war lance and lifted up the future. Not with naivety, not with blind hope, but with the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had buried too many sons and had seen too many winters stained with grief. In this final act of negotiation, Cochise didn't lose his fire. He redirected it. He protected his people not just with arrows, but with honor, strategy, and dignity. And to ensure that the government kept its word, he demanded that Tom Jeffords be appointed the Indian agent for the reservation, not just as a bureaucrat, but as a symbol of trust. Washington agreed. For a few years, the peace held. Cochise lived out his final days among his people, in the land he had fought for, in the silence of the mountains that had guarded him for so long. No more ambushes, no more cavalry bugles in the distance, just the wind through the canyons and the distant laughter of children no longer afraid. He died in 1874, just 2 years after the treaty was signed, but he died free on his own terms in his own land. Cochise, the war chief, the mountain ghost, the legend, chose peace not because he was weak, but because he was wise, because he knew that the ultimate act of strength is knowing when to stop fighting, not for lack of will, but for love of one's people. In the twilight of the Apache Wars, as the dust of decades of conflict slowly began to settle, a legend quietly approached his end. Cochise, once the fierce and unyielding war chief of the Chiricahua Apache, spent his final years not atop a war horse or in ambush among the crags of the Dragoon Mountains, but leading his people in a fragile peace within the borders of the reservation he had helped secure. After 2 relentless decades of resistance, Cochise's name had become synonymous with both fear and reverence. To the U.S. military, he was a ghost, impossible to track, impossible to kill. To his people, he was the embodiment of survival itself. But even the strongest warriors eventually lay down their weapons, and Cochise too grew weary. Age, illness, and the wounds of long war wore on him like erosion on stone. Between 1872 and 1874, Cochise remained chief of the Chiricahua, governing not with brutality, but with the deep wisdom earned through blood and fire. He maintained his authority not because he imposed it, but because he had earned it. His word remained law among his people, and even the U.S. officers at the nearby military outposts knew better than to provoke the old chief unnecessarily. As the Americans watched this once wild frontier slowly become lines on a map, they too began to see Cochise not just as a threat, but as a leader in the purest sense of the word. In this new chapter of reservation life, Cochise showed an adaptability that many never expected. While he remained fiercely protective of Apache sovereignty, he did not lash out irrationally. He oversaw the internal affairs of his band, resolved disputes, and carefully navigated the treacherous waters of post-war diplomacy. Through the guidance of Tom Jeffords, his white ally and blood-bonded friend, Cochise maintained a line of communication with U.S. authorities. That relationship was one of the few bridges between cultures forged in mutual respect rather than conquest. But time is a war that no warrior wins. By the early 1870s, Cochise's health had begun to deteriorate. Rumors spread quietly among his people that their chief was in pain. Some believed it was the spirits of fallen enemies come to haunt him. Others whispered of a wasting disease. Modern historians suspect he suffered from stomach cancer, a slow and excruciating illness that sapped his strength little by little. But Cochise, even in illness, kept his dignity intact. He did not wail. He did not complain. Instead, he prepared, silently, for the journey all warriors must one day take alone. By mid-1874, Cochise's condition worsened rapidly. Though the peace held firm, the reservation was still a tense and unpredictable place. The U.S. government, true to its pattern, had begun to consider relocating the Chiricahua to another area, breaking the promises made only 2 years prior. Cochise, even as his body failed him, remained firm in his stance. As long as he lived, his people would remain on the land they were promised, and no one dared challenge him. Sometime during that year, perhaps in early summer, Cochise breathed his last. There was no fanfare, no recorded speeches, no white officer's journal to describe the moment. Just silence, the kind that falls like a blanket over a people who have lost not just a leader, but a symbol of who they are. The Chiricahua, bound by deep cultural tradition, took his body into the Dragoon Mountains, sacred ground where he had once defied entire battalions with terrain and cunning. According to custom, his burial site was kept secret. A chief like Cochise could not rest beneath a marked stone, vulnerable to desecration or curiosity. Instead, his people carried him into the heart of the mountains he loved, perhaps in the shadow of a hidden cliff or beneath the whispering pines. They buried him with care, with ceremony, and with weapons, so he would not be defenseless in the spirit world. To this day, no one knows the exact location of his grave, and perhaps it's better that way. Some stories aren't meant to be unearthed, but his spirit was not buried with him. Cochise remains etched into the history of the American Southwest like a scar across desert rock, not just as a warrior or a chief, but as a paradox. He was feared, and yet deeply respected. He waged war but sought peace. He was merciless in battle but never without honor. Even those who once called him enemy could not deny the power of his presence. His intelligence, his resolve, and his ability to lead men through unimaginable hardship. In many ways, Cochise's death marked the end of an era, the final chapter of a truly sovereign Apache world. After his passing, the Chiricahua would face broken treaties, forced removals, and decades of marginalization. They would fight again, under leaders like Geronimo. But the spirit of the Apache would never again be as untamed and unbowed as it had been under Cochise. His final years were quiet, but not forgotten. His death was invisible to history's eye, but not to its memory. In every wind that blows through the Dragoon Mountains, in every canyon shadow where a warrior once waited, in every tale whispered beside firelight, the name of Cochise remains. He was more than a man. He was a nation unto himself. And even now, long after the rifles have fallen silent, his legacy rides on the wind, untouchable, undefeated, and immortal. In the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where sun-scorched plains give way to towering red rock cliffs and the wind whispers secrets through the canyons, the name Cochise still lingers, not as an echo of the past, but as a living presence etched into the very bones of the land. His was not a legacy written by the victors of war or politicians in faraway capitals. It was carved by fire, blood, and an unbreakable will to remain sovereign in the face of unstoppable change. Cochise wasn't merely a warrior, he was the embodiment of resistance. Resistance not only against the encroachment of soldiers and settlers, but against the slow erosion of identity, dignity, and freedom. Long before historians tried to summarize his life in textbooks or biographies, the people of the Chiricahua Apache had already enshrined him in their oral traditions. Not as a myth, but as a man who stood tall when the world tried to force him to kneel. His legacy endures in more than stories. The Dragoon Mountains, once his refuge and fortress, are now hallowed ground. Every trail, every hidden pass, holds the memory of a leader who outwitted entire regiments. The town of Cochise, Arizona, bears his name as a quiet tribute. Across the region, monuments and plaques try to capture in bronze and stone what can only truly be felt when you stand beneath the same sun that once beat down on a young war chief, spear in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. But perhaps the greatest monument to Cochise is not physical, it is moral. His story remains a blazing reminder of what leadership, integrity, and resistance truly mean. In an age when entire cultures were being swallowed by colonization, Cochise demanded respect, not as a favor, but as a right. He didn't fight to conquer, he fought to exist. Unlike many figures of the Old West, sheriffs, gunslingers, and outlaws whose fame was forged in fleeting headlines, Cochise's name carries the weight of a people's survival. His negotiations with General Oliver O. Howard were not signs of surrender, but of wisdom. He saw beyond the next raid, the next skirmish. He saw a future where his people might live, not as conquered subjects, but as a sovereign nation within a vanishing world. And though he died in 1874, likely from illness, his death did not close the chapter on his influence. Generations of native leaders have drawn strength from his example. His defiance shaped the next generation of warriors, including the indomitable Geronimo, who would take up the fight when Cochise was gone. It is no coincidence that both names, Cochise and Geronimo, live on with such force in American memory. They were not just men, they were thunder in human form. Cochise's life challenges us still. What does it mean to lead with honor in the face of destruction? What does it mean to protect your people not just with weapons but with wisdom? His story reminds us that real strength isn't just in striking, it is in knowing when to stand firm and when to speak peace. He never sought fame, he never asked to be immortalized, but legends do not wait for permission, they rise, they resist, they remain. And now, if you've felt the power of this story, if the fire in Cochise's spirit moved you, let it stop here. Hit that like button to help more people discover the real stories of the Old West, the ones that weren't written by Hollywood, but lived by warriors of flesh, blood, and honor. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a tale of forgotten legends, untamed frontiers, and the souls who shaped the land we walk today. And if you want to continue this journey, if the spirit of the Apache still calls to you, then you must watch our next story. Geronimo, the last Apache warrior. His saga picks up where Cochise left off, with even more fury, pain, and defiance, because some fires refuse to go out. They simply pass from one soul to the next, and tonight, that fire burns in you. Let it burn, let it roar, and follow us deeper into the wild heart of the Old West.